the Oxfam conference, the EU and the fight against tax haven. My name is Chiara Putaturo. I'm the Tax Inequality Policy Advisor at the Oxfam EU office, and I will be chairing the online event today. Before digging into the topic, I provide you with some housekeeping information. I'm sure that you know them by heart, but it's always useful to remind them. So the event is recorded, and you will receive the link to the recording in an email in the next days. Your microphone and camera should be automatically turned off, but I invite you to not switch them on apart from the speakers. The conference will last 2 hours and is divided into panels. The last half an hour will be reserved for Q&A. You can write the questions in the chat with also your job if it's relevant, and the speaker you would like to address the question to. I kindly ask you to not use the chat for other kind of communications. Thanks. And we can now enter into the topic of the event. So why are we here today? We are organizing this conference today since this year the EU is reforming its main instrument that was designed to tackle tax havens. That is the list of non-cooperative jurisdiction, or EU list of tax havens. We will hear why the EU list is under reform and what needs to be improved. In the context of the current health and economic crisis, it is crucial that we find more effective solutions to tackle tax havens. Tax havens deprive countries around the world of significant resources to run essential public services for the citizens, and particularly the poorest and women. Those resources are urgently needed to strengthen health services and social protection, and to fund a fair and sustainable post-COVID recovery. Today, we have the opportunity to hear about the magnitude of the problem and about the current EU reform from prominent speakers who are directly engaged in tackling the issue from different perspectives. So let me introduce our panel. We will first hear the experience of a journalist, or better, the journalist of the probably biggest tax scandals worldwide, the Panama Papers. He's the person who received the first leaks from an anonymous source in 2015. And for his Panama Papers investigation, he gained, together with other journalists, the Pulitzer Prize in 2017. He's currently the head of the investigative unit of the Munich-based newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung. My welcome to Bastian Obermeier. Hello. With him in the first panel, we have a representative of a civil society organization, Jane Nalunga, also expert on trade, tax, and investment-related issues. She's the country director of SEATINI Uganda. SEATINI stands for Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiation Institute, and it is a sub-regional NGO operating in Eastern and Southern Africa on awareness raising, capacity building, and advocacy on trade and tax justice topics. So welcome, Jane. After the discussion with Bastian Obermeier and Jane Nalunga, we will have a second panel starting at around 11:45, where we will hear more from institutional speakers about the EU list of tax havens and the current reform. So we will be joined by Benjamin Angel from the European Commission, that I can see is already there, Paul Tang from the European Parliament, welcome, he's also already there, and Morten Bodskov, the Danish Minister of Taxation. I really hope you stay with us until the end, so you will be able to interact with our speakers in the Q&A. So with that, let's go to our first panelist, Bastian. So you have been behind some of the biggest tax scandals covering media headlines absolutely everywhere in the planet. The Panama Papers was probably the leakage of the century. After looking at the insides of how those tax havens were used, what was the most shocking elements on the tax avoidance schemes that you can tell us? Please, Bastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope you're all having a good sound. So, when I received the Panama Papers, I wasn't so easy to be shocked already, because I've worked on tax havens before, but I'm still shocked how grown-up politicians can accept this ridiculous farce that we see as tax havens there, and this smear theater that there are companies that are not really companies, with people who are not really working for them, with letterboxes who are too small for the many names on it, for example, Luxembourg, and with millions and billions of US dollar being treated like peanuts, and you know, all this scheme, this theater of the absurd, you know, existing only on paper. And that was something that that shocked me, and that I still have really problems to understand how politicians can simply accept it. So one example, when we published after the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, which is more about big multinational corporations avoiding taxes, we did a story about Nike, the big shoe company. So I decided to have a look how this works in Germany. And I went and I bought a pair of Nike shoes in Munich. And then I looked at in the paper, and I realized I did not buy the shoes in Munich, and I didn't buy it from Nike Germany, but I bought the shoes in Belgium, from Nike Belgium. And I thought, that's ridiculous. That can't be. So I looked it up in the German company register, and I found the purpose of Nike Germany being to help Nike Belgium selling shoes in Germany. And if someone out there is saying that this sounds like something how things should be, I mean, it's obviously not. You know, it's a charade, and people see through it. When I tell our readers, you know, the shoes that you buy here in Munich, you in reality buy in Belgium, they're all saying like, what? I mean, how can this be? And the same is when I was in Luxembourg for the Luxembourg leaks the first time. I went from, so I looked up the addresses of huge German companies in Luxembourg, where we had seen that billions had been, you know, shoveled from here to there. So I thought they must have like huge headquarters. And I went from door to door and knocked on the doors and rang the bells and tried to speak to someone from those big multinational companies. And I didn't get anyone to speak with me because there weren't really people working for them. And this is, you know, the big companies are pretending to have real substance there. And Luxembourg is pretending that they don't know that this is not the case. And Germany is pretending that they don't know all this. And we are here, and we should just, you know, simply accept it. That's, you know, something. This is this farce was really shocking me, and it is still annoying me, to be honest.
Thank you, Bastian. I think farce, theater of absurd, is really a powerful image to describe the tax havens. And thank you also for the tangible and powerful examples. So these are elements that maybe we as ordinary citizens can't see very easily, but you can see and report thanks to your work as investigative journalists on the ground. And another thing we cannot see is the revenue losses because of tax havens. Tax Justice Network estimates that this amounts to over $427 billion annually, and the EU is estimated to lose about 20% of its corporate tax revenue every year as a result of profit shifting to tax haven. But this is not just a European problem. So my first question to Jane. Jane, what are the consequences of tax havens and corporate tax avoidance for Uganda and other developing countries? So, Jane, you can unmute your microphone, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yara, and thank you so much, people who are on the participants. And thanks so much to the previous speaker, because he has given the context, very interesting context. Indeed, there is a link between tax havens and what's happening in developing countries, especially poor countries when it comes to increasing poverty levels. This is because tax havens, they provide the legal machinery and also protection for illegal and legal tax avoiders and evaders. So it's a pull factor for this money. And this is denying so many countries the public revenue, which they would need for hospitals, for schools, for clean water, for roads, for the provision of social services. And this is becoming really critical when you look at the what COVID has done to our economies, and also the health crisis as because of the COVID pandemic. Everywhere in Africa, countries are trying to address the post-COVID economic recovery, but the resources are not there. And this is also linked to the increasing indebtedness. Most of our countries are becoming indebted, getting more loans to be able to provide just for PPPs, the protections, the protections for COVID, let alone even getting resources for the vaccine. So our countries are in dire need of resources, yet these tax havens are providing a safe haven for the ill-gotten illicit financial flows. Chiara has already pointed out the amount of money which is lost through tax havens. In fact, when you look at the different researches which have been done, the amount lost is really, really staggering. Some time back, there was the high-level panel on IFF, normally known as the Mbeki report. It reported that Africa loses more than 50 billion in illicit financial flows annually, and most of these resources go to tax havens. Another study by the Global Alliance for Tax Justice says that just the tax losses, not just the illicit financial flows, but just the tax losses annually comes up to 25.7 billion every year in corporate abuse by multinational corporations, and that this is equivalent to 52.46% of the continent's combined health spending, and it equates to 28.6% of Africa's combined education spending. This is really, really staggering, that if we can be able to retain this money on the continent, it would go a long way in addressing the challenges facing Africa. But we also need to remember that poverty levels are becoming higher, yet average growth in terms of our economy is becoming lower because of the COVID pandemic. So we need resources. And we have the youth bulge. So there are so many challenges facing the continent that we need those resources very, very urgently, like yesterday. And for now, what's the biggest challenge on that table is that there is very little incentive for multinational companies not to place their monies in tax havens. You know, there are no incentives, and multinational companies will continue doing that unless something drastic is really done. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jane, for the very powerful figures. So from what you say, it's clear that tackling tax haven is not only relevant for EU coffers, but also for domestic revenue mobilization in developing countries. And if we think at donors, also for the policy coherence for development. But let's go back to Bastian. So before the tax scandals that you contributed to disclose, there was a sense that rich individuals, officials, and large companies were operating under total impunity and governments were turning a blind eye. Do you think that anything has improved since the Panama Papers, and what still needs to be done? Please, Bastian.
So looking back, a lot has changed, but it's not enough by far. What we do see is that the fight against money laundering and against tax evaders that had already begun before the Panama Papers already, that there have been, you know, good steps. And we can see, especially when we look at the big players, at the banks, the big banks, they don't really dare to do the very easy tax avoiding business anymore with like ordinary rich people, to say so. Like if you're only having, you know, a couple of million euros and you go to your bank and you say, you know, I don't want to pay taxes, they are going to tell you now in your face, that's your problem. It's illegal. We advise you to pay your taxes. But if you are the heir of a multi-million inheritance and you go to the bank and say, you know, I have 500 million euros and I don't like taxes, then they will give you, you know, a couple of lawyers and they'll have a bulletproof construct, from Bermuda to Panama and I don't know. And in the end, you won't be paying taxes. So the system itself is still in place and it's also still working. And here we are only speaking about rich individuals and not about corporations. So the most significant step that we see after the Panama Papers, aside from thousands of investigations, was probably that many countries, they said that they would now have registers of beneficial owners, and that is something that's really important, and that is happening in, even in tax havens like BVI. Even they agreed to have at some point a public register of beneficial owners, which is, of course, a huge problem for people doing just plain illegal stuff. But having looked with the Open Looks investigation at Luxembourg, a country that does already have a public register of beneficial owners, we saw that there were still many problems. I think more than half of the companies did not really say who their beneficial owner was. And in other cases, we just had, conflicting information, so that you couldn't really see who was the owner. And then it still needs someone really looking at it, really, really diving into it. So there's no automatic system detecting problems. It's still being used by many corporations, and they wouldn't go to Luxembourg if they wouldn't see the tax advantage. It's not a country where you go because it's so important infrastructure-wise and all this. So I think that while the registries are really helpful against tax evasion and money laundering, there's still way to go to have more transparency for big corporations. I think this is the fight that organizations like Oxfam and people who are really interested in this have to dedicate in the next couple of years. And I think this is really important. I think country by country reporting is just necessary. It's just like essential. And I think also when I go out in the streets and I ask people what do they think, where do the big companies here pay taxes? They don't know about most of this. So it's still a topic that even we as journalists have something to gain if we are reporting on this and translating to the people. And if you explain to someone that there's a big multinational corporation making a ton of money in Germany, and you ask them, well, this corporation should pay taxes, I mean, they all are going to say, of course, here. And then we can explain, no, they don't. And I think that's something where still, there's still way to go there.
Thanks, Bastian. So you mentioned the progress that have been done concerning the due diligence of clients by banks. Also on the side of beneficial ownership of companies, even if in that case the implementation should be monitored a bit better. And I'm also glad that you mentioned public country by country reporting. Tax transparency can really help a lot in shining a light on profit shifted to tax haven, especially if it covers all countries globally. That is something that the European Parliament and the Council will be discussing in the next weeks. So beyond the EU level, there are other reforms that could contribute to tackle tax havens. And I would like to hear on that from Jane. So Uganda has been losing billions from tax avoidance over the past years. And we know that you work to strengthen the country legal framework to weed out tax avoidance. But this, we know that will also depend a lot on the political will at international level to leverage the right reforms and to make the international tax system fairer. So from a country like Uganda, what are, according to you, Jane, the challenges and progresses in the global tax agenda? We know that the answer would deserve more time, but could you provide it in around 5 minutes? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Yala. It is true there has been progress in the global tax agenda. The issues around the BEPS project, the country-by-country reporting, the inclusive framework. But even within the areas of progress, there have been challenges. We have seen challenges when it comes to the global tax agenda. In terms of inclusivity, there is little inclusiveness of especially developing countries, and the whole debate around being on that table is still an issue on that table. And the saying from developing countries has been that if you are not on that table, you are on the menu. So that whole issue of the involvement and participation of developing countries in the global tax agenda has been limited. There are challenges around capacity to implement the complex rules, but there are also challenges around effective legislation. But there has been progress, but there are also remaining challenges in terms of process, but also in terms of substantive issues, which would help Africa and developing countries to avoid, to reduce on tax avoidance. I will talk about just two of them. Is the UN tax body. That discussion around UN tax body is still ongoing, and for us in developing countries, we hope it would be faster. A global intergovernmental tax body at the UN is necessary, and it's essential to be able to put in place global rules that can go a long way in addressing tax avoidance and tax evasion. That's one area. Another area today, which is a substantive area, is the issue around the digital economy, how to tax the digital economy or e-commerce. COVID has greatly changed the trajectory of trade. In fact, during the traditional trade of the brick and mortar, we have had problems of IFF's tax avoidance, but this has been multiplied, so many times because of the shift to the digital economy. And if the tax havens have also mutated also into being data havens, and this has also increased the outflow of resources from Africa. Yet at the global level, there is still a gap when it comes to rules, how to be able to tax the digital economy. You look at the current rules at the OECD, they are best endeavor. Yet in the WTO, there are also challenges there because already in the WTO, there is a moratorium on taxing the digital trade. So there is a need to have a coherence between the discussions in the OECD and the discussions going on in the WTO to synchronize that. But it's also important that the needs of the developing countries to be able to tap into the taxes under the digital economy are put on the table, because Africa is losing a lot of money. And as I pointed out earlier, Africa needs resources more than ever today. So the rules of the game at the global level should allow developing countries to be able to effectively tax the digital economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. You touched upon a lot of issues, and last one, that one of the taxation of the digital economy. We know that digital companies are those that are profiting the most during this time, and they are not enough taxed. This will deserve another panel probably, but yeah, to go back on the topic of this panel, the tax havens, and in particular the EU list of tax haven. I would like to know from Bastian and Jane few lines on the topic that we will better discuss in the second panel, the EU list of tax haven. So my question to Bastian is, from your point of view, has the EU list been effective to tackling tax havens, and if not, how should it be reformed?
Well, so first of all, I think it's a good idea to have a blacklist, because shaming countries who are taking away millions of taxes from other countries, and countries who are helping big corporations to effectively plunder, large parts of Africa, which is such a tragedy. They really should be shamed. So I think it's a good idea to have this blacklist. But when I look at the blacklist and you see American Samoa, Dominica, Fiji, Guam, Palau, I mean, come on, that's not the big tax havens we're looking at in this world. This isn't gonna solve the problem. I mean, it's small countries without the lobby, especially without the lobby in Europe. So I think while the idea and the political will to shame tax havens and maybe even at some point to sanction them, by the way, is a good thing. It's not really helpful if you exclude the real tax havens. I mean, to start in the European Union, where's Netherlands on the list? You know, where's Luxembourg? Where's Ireland? We all know where the big money from Apple goes to. So I think it's not an honest list of tax havens, and for that reason, it's also not really useful. And I think we have to be honest. We have to find real criteria, and then we have to be strict and name what we see. And that's, you know, we are back in the theater of the absurd. We are back in the farce picture that I used at the beginning. If American Samoa, Dominica, Fiji, Guam, and Palau are the biggest tax haven problems of the European Union, I mean, then we don't have really issues there.
Thank you, Bastian. We will for sure touch upon some of these gaps that you mentioned in the second panel. I would like to ask to Jane a slightly similar questions. From your point of view, how should the EU list be reformed, in particular to have a positive impact on developing countries?
Okay, thank you so much, Yara. I have the same views as Bastian. When I looked at that list, I was totally surprised, you know, that such countries will be on that list. And I read it again and again. In fact, I sent an email to a friend to say, have you seen this list? You know, is it the black list? Said, yes, that's the black list. So it is true that the EU list is not catching the worst offenders. It isn't. So I think it's really, really important that the process and criteria should be reformed. To include that the reform can first of all even include the definition of harmful tax practices. What do they mean? You know, and there should be also transparency in the process. And when you look at the developing country on that list, a number of them have just failed to comply maybe to the international standards which have been set. And maybe in the first place, they didn't even have a chance to agree on those international standards. And some of them even don't have the capacity, it's an issue of capacity to be able to implement those standards. So I think it's really, really important that the process is reformed so that it really, because that shaming and naming, like Bastian is saying, is good. And for me, I support that, and it will be a long way to go to be able to help in companies avoiding this vice. But the way it's done, it doesn't really add value. There is also the issue of being transparent. You know, we need a process that's really transparent and that's really consistent. And there are also some economic indicators which can be used, you know, economic indicators which shows a typical tax haven. For example, if you have zero or a low tax rate jurisdiction, you should be already on that list. So we need to be the whole process of reform list and how countries go on that list should be transparent, and the reform criteria and process should be also transparent and inclusive.
Thank you very much, Jane, for the details, recommendations. And I'm sure that this point that you both raised will be addressed in the next panel. So unfortunately, Bastian Obermeier cannot join the Q&A, but have to leave just after this panel. So I profit on this moment to thank him for his contribution. But while I invite Jane Nalunga to remain with us to participate to the Q&A at the end. So the first panel has showed us how the problem of tax haven is still persistent. And we already started to see what the solutions can be. At the European level, the EU created this list of non-cooperative jurisdiction, of a list of tax haven in 2017. And to give a bit of background, this list is based on a definition on harmful tax practices elaborated 14 years ago, and is managed by a body in the Council that is called the Code of Conduct Group, formed by representatives of EU member states. We have heard from the previous panel some of the shortcomings of the list, notably the lack of real tax havens by Bastian, or the lack of transparency, the weak definition of harmful tax practices, and the asymmetric impact on some developing countries from Jane. Civil society organizations, and among them Oxfam, have been calling for a review of the listing process and the definition of harmful tax practices. But so there is good news. And this is also the reason why we are here today. Last summer, the European Commission recognized that the process needs to be reformed and committed to update it. As a result, member states at the Council level are currently working at a reform and are expected to come forward with their proposal by the beginning of 2022. So this year we have a unique opportunity to make this list really effective. And this is why we want to speak about the reform and what needs to be improved. And we will do it with 3 critical voices directly engaged in the current review process of the EU list of tax haven. So I can welcome the 3 speakers of the second panel. I welcome, first of all, Paul Tang, who is the chair of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Tax Matters, FISC. He's a member of the European Parliament since July 2014, as part of the group of Socialists and Democrats. Previously, Paul Tang worked for the Danish Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Bureau of Economic Policy Analysis. And after that, he became member of the Dutch Parliament. Our second speaker is Benjamin Angel, Director of Direct Taxation, Tax Coordination, Economic Analysis and Evaluation at the Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union, also known as DG Taxud in the European Commission. Benjamin Angel works for the Commission since 1994. And in the past, he was also a member of the Cabinet of the Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs. So welcome also to Mr. Angel. And later, at around 11:10, we will be joined by Morten Botskov, the Danish Minister of Taxation. He was appointed in this role in June 2019, and previously from 2011 to 2013, he served as Danish Minister of Justice. So with that, let's go to our first panelist of this discussion, Paul Tang. So Mr. Tang, in January this year, the European Parliament has voted with a very large majority resolution to reform the EU list of tax havens. So my question to you is, what are the problems about the list and what are the recommendations of the European Parliament for the reform of the listing process? So I invite Mr. Tang to unmute his microphone. Perfect, we can see.
Yes, and I must say the analysis of Bastian and Jane was spot on. I don't think the European Parliament made a very different analysis and came to the conclusion that the current list is confusing and ineffective, which is even still, I think, diplomatic. I don't think we could use the word theater of the absurd in a resolution of the European Parliament, but it could have been equally good characterization. And I think it has been mentioned why it's currently the jurisdictions on the list cover about 2% of the global tax avoidance. One of the main perpetrators, the Cayman Islands, which by estimates is responsible for about 60 billion euro in lost tax revenue, is not on the list. So the criteria, and like Jane said, one of the criteria are not good. If a country has a zero tax rate, or in the case of Cayman Islands, they don't have a corporate tax system, well, you should be on the list. So the list excludes countries that should be better criteria. That should also apply to European countries. I come from the Netherlands, but the European Parliament is one of the few European institutions that dare to criticize the member states within the EU. We have been focal on not just the Netherlands, but also Luxembourg and Ireland, which are also very strong, have a very strong industry of tax avoidance. So we need better criteria, and it needs to apply it not just to outside the EU, but also inside the EU. And we should have a much more clear process, right? So countries that now are on the grey list, well, can stay on the grey list for a long time. And just recently, I've witnessed the case of Australia, where, well, thanks to pressure from the European Parliament, I believe we were able to make Australia move. But this is what you need if you're on the grey list. You need to go into action, and Australia and Turkey were on the grey list, but unclear why they stayed on the grey list. And of course, we need countermeasures. So once a country is on a blacklist, it should be very clear what the consequences are, and there should be pressure on the countries on the grey list. I think that sort of sums up the conclusions from the European Parliament. In itself, it could be, and let's face it, it could be a very effective instrument, right? If we tackle, if we put conditions on jurisdictions inside and outside the EU, the world would definitely change. If we could reduce the role of the Cayman Islands, it would be to the benefit of the taxpayers in the European Union, but it would almost certainly also help continents like Africa. So in that sense, we have a common goal. Our interests are aligned here. So this is these are, let's say, conduits through which money is channeled and taken out of the sight of tax administration, whether it's in Africa, Europe, or anywhere else. Now, so in that sense, the European Parliament thinks it's an important instrument and wants to improve upon this instrument. The problem is, of course, that much of the discussions are, I think transparency is, by the way, very important in the topic of tax avoidance. I've come over the years to appreciate how important transparency is, because usually it can't stand the light of day. And I think investigative journalism has helped a lot by uncovering the facts and giving political momentum to the debate. Certainly true for the work in the European Parliament. When I started in 2014, we had a succession of, let's say, temporary committees on these matters, starting with LuxLeaks. Now it's a permanent subcommittee, which shows that the European Parliament is very much devoted to it. And I think transparency is crucial. That goes for country by country reporting, uncovering the leaks, but it's also true for decision making. I think Benjamin Angel is one of the few exceptions. He's one of the people on the table that comes out in public and discusses the matters. But usually this is done in back rooms by people you and I don't know. And it should be much more politicized, because the good thing is, if you bring it out in the open, you will find very strong public support for change, right? And it's not even an issue for a left-wing guy, like left loody like me. Now, I also find that on the other side of the political spectrum, on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, people really detest tax avoidance because it's basic fairness that everyone needs to pay taxes, and it doesn't exclude. So I think we still can find a broad support for that. But that means that we need to have it out in the open. So transparency is crucial for changing the debate. And let me conclude also by saying that there is reason for hope, right? If only because we are now in the second crisis, never waste a good crisis. I see at least changes. If I look at the country, I've been very critical of my own country. I've made the European Parliament say that the Netherlands is a tax haven. That by now is adopted by the general public. So the Dutch realize they live in a tax haven. It's just not a tax haven for themselves. It's for the big corporates and for rich individuals like Isabel dos Santos. So the awareness has grown, and you also see in the Netherlands their opinions are shifting. And recently, for example, in the run-up of the election, I worked together with NGOs to put pressure to have a public action and political action to put an end to the Netherlands as EU tax haven. And we can only do that because the awareness has grown. And I think that the action will be, in the end, will be successful sooner or later.
Thank you. It's good to hear these changes. So you mentioned as weakness of the problem, the criteria, the transparency. In particular, you recommended to include also more the European Parliament. You talk about countermeasures. So we as Oxfam, we share the problems and the recommendation about the list that you just presented and that were in the European Parliament resolution. Before hearing from Mr. Angel, I would like to stress and then add some points from my side. So Jane, in the first panel, she referred to the need to blacklist zero and low tax rate jurisdiction. That is something that we also strongly support. In a recent study, Oxfam found out that only 2 out of 31 countries with zero or low corporate tax rates are currently blacklisted. In terms of inclusiveness, we highly suggest to set up a working group or a consultative body that brings together non-EU countries, particularly developing countries, but also civil society and experts to facilitate dialogue on decisions made. We know that also the Parliament included this in the resolution, and we believe this could increase the legitimacy of the process. And then I recall a point highlighted by Jane, that so is the situation of some developing countries that did not participate in the elaboration of some standards that are required by the list and often lack the capacity to implement them. So we recommend to take into account specific situation of developing country regarding the criteria around transparency and the OECD standards. And so I can pass to Benjamin Angel. So my first question to you would be, first of all, what is the status of the reform of the list? And then do you see room for improvements so that the European Parliament and the civil society organization recommendation can be taken on board? Can we expect progress to make it effective and fit for purpose? Paul Tang said that you are one of the few people, the Commission, that speak very openly about the topic. So we are really curious to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you for your invitation. Let me say first a few words about the results achieved so far, because I find that the previous speakers were right in saying that we are not yet where we should be, but probably a bit too critical on the journey that we have traveled. The EU list as such is first a relatively recent creation. It has been launched in 2017 only. So we have de facto less than 4 years of experience. In that period of time, we have screened 95 countries. We have obtained changes of legislation for 130 tax regime, 130. We have used the list to magnify the capacity of the OECD and of the other key players in this field to attract new members. Because among the conditions that we have, some of them require the countries concerned to join the international convention that exists on exchanging tax information or to join the BEPS inclusive framework. So thanks to the listing process, we have, for instance, 27 countries which join the automatic exchange of information internationally, and 28 that join the BEPS inclusive framework. This should not be underestimated, and I think this is valuable. Now, is the situation perfect? Certainly not. The criteria focus at the moment a lot on transparency first, and a bit on the harmful tax practices, but there are clearly shortfalls. For the criteria on exchanging information, for instance, one very well-known shortfall is that for the time being, we focus a lot on requesting the country concerned to commit to exchange information, but our approach is a bit too legalistic. That is, we don't really check whether when a request is made, we effectively get that information. And this is certainly something that should change in the future. Second, there is the issue that Paul mentioned and that most NGOs mention and that you mentioned as well, Chiara, of the jurisdiction with a 0% tax rate. And it's certainly weird for everyone and weird for the Commission as well, that so far we do not tackle the situation of these countries in a completely satisfactory way. It is not that there are no criteria. For jurisdiction having a 0% statutory tax rate, we check that there is a legislation requesting economic substance. And it's a relatively heavy process, but clearly it's insufficient. This bit of the discussion is, however, very clearly connected to the international discussion on Pillar 2 in the OECD. So once there is an agreement on minimum effective taxation, and once we have transposed that agreement on minimum effective taxation in EU law, then it will be the moment to introduce in the code of conduct among the criteria that is used by the group, a criteria that would mandate third country to subscribe to this OECD good practice, so that again, we use the list as an amplifier of the capacity to have a broader set of countries to join international good practices. We can't do it before, because as a rule, we never ask to third countries things that are not applicable to our own member state. It doesn't mean the situation is perfect in our member state. We all know the difficulties that the previous speakers have eloquently stressed. But sometimes when they breach EU law, it does happen. We open an infringement procedure, we bring them to court, so we do something. But we can't ask third countries things that do not exist in our legal framework internally. So where do we stand in the reform of the Code of Conduct today? We have pleaded for a reform in two directions. We have pleaded for reform of the domestic part and of the international part. For the domestic part, that is the one that applies to member state, which is the old part, it exists since 1997. We pleaded for broadening the mandate of the code so that it can examine not only measures which are constructed in a preferential way, but also measures which are non-preferential, but which are harmful and distortive. It's a difficult discussion. We didn't expect it to be easy. We have had already 5 or 6 rounds with member state. I think today, if we were operating under a qualified majority, clearly this qualified majority would be there. but we need consensus. And we are not there yet. We still have a small group of member states which is reluctant. So we are trying to continue this discussion in earnest. And at some point, it will probably be useful that the issue is raised at higher level, and that the ministers themselves have the opportunity to have an exchange on this question, because this is not a question that can be left only to technicians of the finance ministry. It has clearly, possibly important ramification. Now, for the external part of the code, I must say the pandemic has had an adverse effect. It has been decided last year not to ask new requirement on anyone. There are new criteria which were already in the pipeline and for which work should continue and develop as soon as the pandemic is behind us. There is the question of the exchange of the country-by-country report, which is already one of the criteria. More importantly, as many of you have mentioned, there is a criteria of having register of beneficial ownership. Here, the code has taken the first step very recently by writing to a group of countries to tell them that we intend to start examining this question in the coming, I don't know, it's difficult to make a prognosis because each time we have made a prognosis on the pandemic, unfortunately, it has been proven wrong. But as soon somehow the situation improves globally, we will start enforcing this criterion more aggressively. We will also at some point bring criteria of effectiveness, that is making sure that when a commitment is taken, it is put in practice. And we started very recently the important discussion on the geographic scope, because so far we have screened 95 jurisdictions, but somehow that's only a part of the planet. And it's interesting when you look at the national list, because we have 11 or 12 member states which have national lists, to see that there are some 60 jurisdictions which are not in the scope of the code of conduct today, but which are mentioned in the national list. So clearly it calls for broadening our attention, and that's a discussion which just started, and I'm sure we will be able to tackle new jurisdiction in probably in the second part of the year. This year is also an important year because this is the one where member states have to take defensive measures against blacklisted jurisdiction. They committed to it, and they are all in the process, for those which did not have it yet, to introduce it. It can be withholding tax, it can be non-deductibility of interest. There's a whole spectrum. Some of them had already a significant one. If you take the country I know best, for instance, if a country is listed for lack of economic substance, there is a withholding tax of 75%, which is relatively on the high side. We need more of this. And thanks to Paul, we have in his work of the Parliament and his work as rapporteur, we also have in EU law new references to the effect of the list that will kick in at some point in the securitization regulation, whereby Paul has obtained an important development with a prohibition on financial institution to hold SPV on blacklisted jurisdiction, and an obligation of information also of financial institution when they have SPV in jurisdiction which are on the gray list. So to sum up, the situation is not perfect, but we should keep in mind that it's a process, and it's a learning process for everyone, including for the member states themselves. There is a continuous effort to improve the criteria and to make the list more effective. It's a challenging one, including diplomatically, because when we introduce new criteria, what it means in practice is we have to rescreen everyone against the new criteria, and that sometimes countries which have been delisted will find themselves on the list again because they don't meet the new criteria. So we are committed to continue this process and to make the list more and more effective and to improve its credibility. And we very much appreciate the support and we're almost tempted to say the friendly kick of the ass of the European Parliament and of the civil society organization, because we need this pressure from the outside to convince the member states to keep on making progress in that direction. So your work is extremely helpful, and the resolution of the European Parliament in particular was absolutely on the radar screen of all member states, and it helps making progress in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Angel, for this very honest picture and for the updates. So the second and last topic I would like to touch on regard the EU tax haven. So we have said the EU countries are not screened at least in the blacklisting process. In the last year, Oxfam has showed that 5 EU member states, Cyprus, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, and Netherlands, continue to have economic indicators typical of tax havens. As an example, Luxembourg, at the center of the Open Lux case, in 2019 had levels of foreign direct investment coming in and out the country that were from 77 to 100 times bigger than its economic weight. And in comparison, for 22 member states who have balanced economic indicators, this level of FDI remains below 2.5 times. Civil society organizations are not the only ones detecting tax haven within the EU. Paul Tang has already mentioned that the European Parliament, in particular in the Tax 3 report, called the European Commission to regard some member states as EU tax haven. The European Commission, even if has not named any member state that's tax haven, but has identified 6 of them for favoring aggressive tax planning in the European Semester and Country Report last year. And I would like also to mention the Council, since the chair of the Code of Conduct Group during the Tax 3 committee hearing in 2018 mentioned the possibility of screening member states against the same criteria set for the EU list. So my second and last questions to Paul Tang is what the EU can do to tackle EU tax haven, and how the definition of harmful tax practices and the Code of Conduct Group can be reformed to serve this purpose. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Not to forget to unmute, right? Now, coming back to what Benjamin said, of course, I try to make a positive remark also on the list of non-cooperative jurisdiction. I think the instrument itself is fine, and that's the reason why the European Parliament, but also NGOs, discuss it, because we recognize it as an important instrument for the, let's say, the future relations, for the future economic relations and the possibilities to tackle tax avoidance. So let's be clear on that. So we want to discuss the reform. Generally speaking, I still think that we need more in general a reform of the corporate tax systems, right? So just keep that in mind. We still have a discussion on what is called the CCCTB. I still think it's important because the current corporate tax system is outdated. Right, it comes from the start of the previous century. It's no longer up to the task. That would make okay, but that's the aim for for after the crisis, so to say. On the reform, I would very much like to see what we try to do, by the way, also with the resolution of the European Parliament, is to have the debate not just in the European Parliament, but also bring it to capital. So what the FIS subcommittee is doing, we try to organize meetings with the national parliaments. National parliaments are usually not on top of it, also because it's like the discussions are in the back room done by the civil servants. And so I very much would like to hope that some of the national parliaments will get involved in Wales and recognize this as an important issue where they can play a role. And this is also why you need to put pressure on, again, public awareness leads to political pressure, and we should try to raise that in capitals. when you look at the situation of EU tax havens, I think we need, let's say, European rules. I already mentioned CCTB, of course, that's on the wish list. But it could also be the OECD negotiations can help by introducing a minimum effective tax rate, which will then be enshrined in EU directives. So that's a way forward. But you also have very much, let's say, national measures that needs to be addressed. And the Code of Conduct Group has, well, as the function of peer pressure, but it has not proven strong enough. So you really need to look, you need to focus on countries as well, because I just mentioned that the action with the NGO, that's also possible because there's good study what the Netherlands needs to change on their side, apart from what is happening at the European and international, what the Netherlands has to change to be no longer a tax haven. So one of the is of course the letterbox companies, which are very prevalent in the Dutch tax landscape, so to say, and which is a crucial vehicle for tax avoidance. For example, just indeed, the foreign direct investment is the canary in the coal mine. In the latest Just Justice report, there was reported that the Netherlands saw about 200 billion going through the Netherlands, I think, to the United Arab Republic. There's 200 billion in 1 year time. That this is what it's clear that this money is not related to any real activity, but is a part of a tax avoidance scheme. I think we need to push pressure. We need European and international changes, structural changes, but we also need to put pressure on the member states themselves and have the debate in there. And it would very much help if we look at the Code of Conduct Group, if the debate on that was more open. I think also transparency would so we now know that there is from Benjamin, there is a majority of member states, but who are the countries that oppose? That should become more public. That would help a great deal. This is the type of transparency. And I would very much like to have more political commitment, because I don't want to have, let's say, the experts discussing this. It should be at the political level. So we asked the Danish minister soon how often he has attended these meetings, and if he wants to attend this meeting much more, because there's much at stake here. This should be raised to the political level. And like I said, I think there is a broad public support for changes in this matter, but we need to turn this into political action.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. So yes, the last question on the same topic to Benjamin Angel. So you already mentioned what so the Code of Conduct is doing to reform the definition of harmful tax practices that will affect also EU tax havens. So what else the EU is doing to tackle EU tax haven? Do you think that it would be possible to have a blacklist of EU tax haven, or screen them with the same or even higher standard than third country, and also give more visibility to the screening of member states? Because even if the blacklist is not so transparent, but at least it's advertised, why we don't know so much about the screening of member states? Thanks.
Thank you. Couple of points. First, indeed, the transparency of the discussion can still be a bit improved, and we hope that further steps will be taken in this direction. Even though, as far as the external part of the list is concerned, we will always have the difficulty that we are talking of sovereign third country. And as such, there is a diplomatic component which calls sometimes for some discretion. There are a lot of contact with third country where we try below the radar screen to push them to do the right thing. And somehow it might not always be easy in those situations to bring the discussion on the public arena. For member states themselves, the Code of Conduct has clearly lost speed and traction. There were many decisions taken as regards harmful tax practices in member states in its first decades of activity, but far less today, primarily because the mandate is too narrow. This mandate on preferential measure only clearly does not match the problem that we find today, and that's the reason why the Commission is pushing hard to a significant broadening of the mandate. Now, globally, the European Union has already done a lot in the field of tax avoidance and tax evasion, and clearly we are in the forefront of the OECD discussion. You know that we have introduced a number of legislation in EULO with ATAD 1 and ATAD 2. We see also the first benefit of the legislation, such as the register of beneficial ownership. Someone has mentioned OpenLux. OpenLux is about information which is now made public and accessible for everyone. This work would not have been possible without the 5th AML directive. And it's interesting, and I heard it from one of the authors of OpenLux yesterday, that just before the register were online, 25,000 companies were dissolved in Luxembourg, just before. And yet they found plenty of problems with those which are still in the register. So it shows that there is value in pushing harder for transparency. Tax evasion and tax avoidance are one of the priorities of the Commission, and certainly of Commissioner Gentiloni. So we have a significant number of initiatives which are in the pipeline. For sure, as soon as there is an OECD agreement on Pillar 2, we will move very quickly to transposition, because Pillar 2 is not a multilateral convention. It will be a common agreement. So as such, nothing prevents us from moving quickly. And this is clearly our intention. So we have already teams working on it. But we will be proposing in the year to come 2 new directives. One which will be targeting shell companies, and clearly shell companies are one of the main difficulties that have been identified in OpenLux, and another one which will push further the requirement for tax transparency. The Commission has also flagged a number of cases its intention to make use of Article 116. This intention is still there, and this article will be used at some point for tackling some problem in some member states, again, in the field of tax avoidance and tax evasion. So it's a process. I think there's a lot of legislation which is in place, and we're just starting somehow to implement this legislation. And to keep in mind, for instance, ATAD 2, some member states have not yet fully implemented. I was talking of the register for beneficial ownership. We still have 8 member states which are late. We have some member states also which probably are too restrictive in the access they give to the register to the public. We still have important discussions which are ongoing also between Council and Parliament on public CBCR, for instance. So it's a process, but if you look at the evolution of the last 10 years, it's certainly going relatively quickly in the right direction.
Thanks. So you both mentioned the need to have a political will and also a political representation in the body that takes decision and discuss EU tax havens and also tax haven beyond the EU. So let's hear the point of view of a political representative from a member state. And I welcome here Mr. Morten Bodskov, that is the Ministry of Taxation of Denmark. Denmark has led the group of countries in the Council asking for strengthened standard and sanction in the EU list of tax haven. So my question to Mr. Bodskov is, what is the position of Denmark on the problem on tax havens and on the list? And at the same time, what member states should do to tackle harmful tax practices in the EU and to reform the Code of Conduct Group? Please, Mr. Bodskov, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank you all for the invitation. I've been looking forward to speak to you today about, as questioned here, the goal we have in, as I see, in common, and that is, of course, to fight tax havens. It's no secret that this topic is important both to me, of course, as a Minister for Taxation here in Denmark, of course, also for the Danish government. And I'd also like to note in this occasion here, when I see me and hear me among friends of highly importance for the European Parliament, the Commission that we just heard, and of course, Oxfam, EBIS, and many of the other NGOs that we work together with, the trade movements, union movements, the civil society organizations, all of you, and all of them are fighting a very important task to stop tax havens. Why is this important? I would like to begin by providing, so to say, the context why the fight against tax haven is of a high priority for me, and of course also for our social democratic government here in Denmark. In Denmark, our welfare state is built on what we call a social contract. We must pay taxes, abide by the law, of course, and contribute to our society. In return, we are entitled to benefits like healthcare and free education. Fighting tax avoidance and securing our tax basis is, of course, therefore crucial. Crucial, first of all, to protect the cohesion of our societies, not least following the pandemic and the economic consequences that has arisen from it. Although most companies pay their fair share of taxes, we have seen examples of companies who do not. Example of companies who went out of their way, so to say, to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, and countries that let them do that. These scandals have also in Denmark, as all around Europe, outraged citizens around the world too. And of course, they all have also outraged me as well. This is why the Danish government is pushing for higher standards to prevent tax evasion and aggressive tax planning. And we do this to protect, as I said, the Danish welfare state and the contract that it is built upon, but also to promote standards and achieve a level of, so to say, playing field globally. This will also, of course, benefit the developing countries that we also need to have in focus here. The work of the EU Code of Conduct Group is, as we see it, of course, important here. It has helped us to get rid of more than 120 harmful tax schemes over the years. And there's a lot about debate about it, of course, but this is progress, and it is good progress. But there's still room, of course, as you also already have discussed here, there's still room for improvements. And these improvements should be based upon the value of, as we see it, equal treatment, and on also transparency standards, of course. It must be evident to blacklisted country and to the public why some countries are on the list and why, of course, others are not. And at the same time, as we see it, there should be more publicity on the work to prevent tax evasion and aggressive tax planning in the EU. So one of my suggestions is that the Code of Conduct Group's website is used consistently to publish results from examination on tax schemes. It is also very important that when we evaluate countries, that their tax schemes, we do it out on an objective criteria. We must aim high when we set standards and criteria that the EU use to examine tax schemes, but we must also keep in mind that we cannot rightfully demand more from countries outside the European Union that we can't live up to within the European Union. Lowering demands for a third country is not the solution. Raising the bar in Europe, as we see it, is. And this is why the updating of the mandate for the Code of Conduct Group is, as we see it, very important. Only with an updated mandate, we can ensure a just and, as we see, a credible EU blacklist. It is also important for me to highlight that we have special obligation to the developing countries. We must make sure that these countries can live up to the international standards that we have agreed on upon the OECD and within the European Union. We have a responsibility to help them and make sure that they are able to do so. Therefore, we provide aid for building long-term sustainable tax administrations in countries that do not already have them. This is an important priority for the Danish government. With an overall framework, so to say, in place, I will share with you my ambitions of revisiting the mandate. The goal is, as I already mentioned, higher standards and slowing down tax evasion and aggressive tax planning. First of all, the Code of Conduct Group should be able to examine all potentially harmful tax structures. This is why we need to provide the ground for examining general tax schemes and not just preferential ones. Secondly, the Code of Conduct Group should be able to evaluate any tax schemes below the threshold of minimum taxation. This will make it possible to examine tax schemes with lower tax or no tax at all. I must say I have high hopes for the OECD negotiation, and I'm optimistic that we can come up with an agreement on minimum taxation by this summer. But in my opinion, this should be included as a criterion in the mandate, regardless of the outcome of the OECD negotiation. If we succeed with extending the scope, the European Union can examine general tax schemes and any tax schemes below the threshold of minimum taxation. This should be in effect, as we see it, as soon as possible. This leads me to what you've also discussed already, to the EU blacklist of tax havens. Here, there is also room for improvement, so to say, but at the same time, I'm also optimistic here, and let me try to explain why this is the occasion. In the European Union, we actually have instruments in place for fighting tax havens, as you know. And the EU blacklist have been successful in gathering countries to change their behavior for the better. But as I've said already, there is room, so to say, for further improvements. We need to expand the geographic scope, so even more relevant countries will be examined by the European Union. And we must strengthen even more on tax transparency. This should be done by delivering soon on criteria 1.5 regarding, as you know, transparency on ownership of business. This is often referred to, as you also already discussed, beneficial ownership criteria. We also need to roll out criteria 3.2. This is regarding effective implementation of the country-by-country information reporting to the tax authorities. And when other new international standards on tax transparency emerge, they should, of course, also be added to these criteria. I believe that my ambition for updating the mandate and strengthening the blacklist could just as well be spoken by Benjamin Angel. He will also be speaking here today. So I have to thank the European Commission for sharing our corner, and thank you for pushing EU further with communications on tax good governance from last summer. However, it is not enough pushing countries on the blacklist. We need to follow up with strict defensive measures against the blacklisted countries, so to say. I believe that blacklisted countries will raise their tax standards only when they feel serious consequences. Only then will they stop acting as tax havens and financial hideaways, so to say. The Danish government is ready to impose the most effective means. We have said that clearly, and yes, we have also said it will be costly affair to the Danish companies if they still use the blacklisted countries in the future. We are actually right now moving forward with 2 new sanctions. First of all, Danish companies will not be able to deduct payments from group affiliated companies in blacklisted countries. For example, a Danish company will not be able to deduct expenses to a parent company in a blacklisted country. With a second measure that we actually have in the parliament also right now, we raise the tax rate on dividends paid from Denmark to a blacklisted country significantly. Today, a company will pay 22% rate in tax in Denmark when it receives dividends from a Danish company. This will be increased to 44%. We support, of course, or we hope to have full support from the Parliament. And with that, hopefully, these measures will be put in place already this summer here. So first of all, thank you once again, but also to sum up, we need an ambitious revision of the Code of Conduct mandate. It should allow all potential harmful tax structures to be examined. And we also think that and the EU blacklist of tax haven must be strengthened. The criteria behind the list must be objective and ambitious. It must reflect the highest international tax standards, and sanctions must strongly encourage the countries to comply, of course. The truth is that when we act together in the European Union, we are strong enough to set standards that will set the agenda and lead the way outside of the European Union. We have already shown that we have proven this in several areas, and I'm sure that we can do it again. And in my opinion, we have to, because no European country have the muscle to make significant impact on its own. We are a small country here in Denmark, and we need the European Union in this field here. We think that different national blacklists and sanctions from one or let's say few countries will not be effective, and it might even erase or aspire to more aggressive tax planning. So we must work together, and we must work strongly together within the international forums that we do. That means the European Union, the OECD, and globally the global forums that we are working in. So once again, thank you very much for taking your time to listen to me as a representative of the Danish government. We are looking very much forward to further cooperation with the European Union, the European Parliament, Oxfam EBS, and other NGOs that work so hardly and good to strengthen our common fight against these tax avoidance and aggressive tax planning companies and countries that we are facing here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Boskov. I know that you can't stay for the Q&A, so thanks really for your contribution, and I hope to see you again. So I also hope that other member states can be as vocal as Denmark in asking and working for a more effective EU list. And we have now arrived at the Q&A sessions. So I invite all participants to write their questions in the chat that you have on the right. Please indicate also your name if you want, your job if it's relevant, and the speaker you would like to address the question to. I remind you that we have in the Q&A still Jane Nalunga, Benjamin Angel, and Paul Tang, while the minister and Bastian Obermeier had to, unfortunately, to leave. So please don't be shy with your questions. We are looking forward to them. Maybe I could start waiting for participants to write their questions. Maybe to Jane, since we haven't heard from you for a while. So what is in general your reaction to what you heard in the second panel? And how do you think that the EU listing process could become more inclusive? In particular, I mentioned the idea of creating a working group or consultative body with non-EU countries, in particular developing countries, and also civil society and experts, to make it more inclusive and also legitimate it. What do you think about that? And please also share with us any reaction to what you heard after. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Diana, and thank you so much to the speakers, Mr. Paul Tang and Mr. Benjamin. It was a very good presentation, and it gives hope that we can be able to tackle this vice of tax avoidance. And I also liked the fact that the two speakers really pointed out that there is room for improvement, and also that the reform process is ongoing. But what the missing link, was the issue of membership. I didn't hear much around that. Because the issue, for example, Mr. Benjamin brought out clearly, and Paul, the issue of political will, political commitment, and political support. And I was asking myself, what about the political support from developing countries and the whole issue around membership of the developing countries? Because the whole issue of ownership of the standards which are coming out has been on the table, So maybe what I want to hear, developing countries going to be members of this working group. Then there is also the issue of the mandate of the working group. It's not a legally binding group, it's a group. So how is it going to enforce the sanctions which the previous speaker talks about, the sanctions and the measures? Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So maybe I can pass to Benjamin Angel to react to this question. And I also address you a first question we have from a participant, Christophe. He asked about the future beneficial ownership criteria, and should it follow the OECD standard or the EU anti-money laundering directive standard? Thanks.
Thank you. One element which I should have said earlier but did not, so thank you, Jane, for offering me the occasion. The group or the code of conduct does not take decision itself. What the group does is to prepare decision of the ministers. So in that sense, we are not in a situation where the ministers are out of the game. Everything finds its way in council conclusion, which are made public. And since you have decision of the ministers, which are therefore validated politically, we have defensive measures which are being introduced in a number of member states. All of them have to do it, and they introduce it via their own legislation. So you will have legislation saying that if a country is on the Annex 1 of the list of non-cooperative jurisdiction for tax purposes, which is a bureaucratic name of the blacklist, then the consequences are the following. It's not the same in all member states because they have a menu of options, but that's how it works. We have also a few pieces of EU law which are directly connected to the blacklist. There's one, the new one I just mentioned, for which Bruno has been instrumental, but we have element in the financial regulation, we have element on the rules of exchange of information, we have element in ATAD, we have more and more actually pieces of legislation which are connected to it. Now, on the more technical question on beneficial ownership, despite the perception and sometimes the accusation from some NGOs, we never enforce unilaterally our own legislation. So the beneficial ownership that is being mentioned as a criteria in the EU listing process is naturally the one which has been discussed internationally within the OECD framework.
Thank you. Maybe next question to Paul Tang. We have heard the description from Bastian Obermeier on the Luxembourg of the shell companies, the lack of workers there. I'm wondering if the same pictures can be found also in Netherlands or in other countries like Ireland. And my question actually is, do you think that the tax system of the EU home tax haven member states will look the same in 10 years from now? Or do you think we will finally have managed to solve some of these problems?
Well, I was hearing Morten Botskov, and he's using the word optimism. I think it's part of the job description of politicians to be optimistic. So yes, I am optimistic, but that's part of the job description. But not only, in all fairness. I truly think that taxation will be very high on the agenda in the years to come. I don't see us return to a policy of austerity and reforms after we have controlled the pandemic. And and at the same time, the public authorities need to balance revenue and expenditure again. And I think this will provide an excellent opportunity for engaging in debates that have been stuck or that have not even been put on the agenda. Think about personal wealth. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. I think there's also an urgent need from fairness and efficiency to address the gaping holes in the tax systems that are still around. And that's why I think new opportunities will arise. Currently, the discussion is still about vaccination and testing, but there will come a point, I think, I'm looking forward to it, that we will return to a bit normal, and these questions will come up. And at that point, I think then there will be political willingness to make these changes. In that sense, I am optimistic for a reason, so to say. And the European Parliament, just one remark on the discussions we had, the European Parliament is also working on an initiative, especially the FISC subcommittee is on an own initiative report on tackling tax avoidance and the reform of the Code of Conduct Group. But we also decided to have an own initiative report on the withholding taxes and the European framework for withholding taxes, because that's one of the issues. There are many ways to avoid, to reroute the money flows to escape the national systems at this stage. And I don't think that, by the way, that the interest and royalty directive has helped a great deal in that was introduced in the past. I think that's one of the reasons why the Netherlands has gained such a huge position. So there's every reason to take that to take a closer look at that. But I also tell this because I know that many people are interested. So please make sure that you get engaged in the discussion in the European Parliament on this as well.
Thanks. So my next question is from journalist Sarah Pites from Tax Notes to Benjamin Angel. So you mentioned that Commissioner Gentiloni has identified some cases of distortion in EU member states that qualify the use of Article 116. Could you elaborate on this? Do you see the use of this article as a way to address harmful tax practices within member states, perhaps more than an intra-EU blacklist?
Well, I would certainly not oppose this article to the effort to reinforce a code of conduct or the possible discussion on having some kind of scoring system of member states. I know that Parliament notably has pleaded very vigorously for such an action to be made, and Commissioner Gentiloni has promised to examine it very seriously. So at the moment we are a bit brainstorming stage. As regards Article 116, I cannot enter into any detail, but this article is in the treaty. It has never been used since the treaty is there, which is a bit weird. It allows to address the situation in some member states that would create distortion on the internal market. And tax regime can be one of them, clearly. So we have identified indeed a few possibilities, and we are in the process of working on the economics, because very clearly the burden of proof is on our side if we make such claim, and it calls for a patient and systematic work, and this is what we're doing.
Thanks. And I have also another question for you to the journalist Autret. She asked about IMF. So until 2008, the IMF had a so-called offshore financial centers program, which was suppressed in 2008. Since then, there is no public funded quantitative analysis on tax havens. Do you think it would be useful to assess the volumes of tax evasions? And if so, why doesn't the Commission do it?
Well, first, there is a vast literature on this topic, and a large number of non-governmental organizations which are also very active. And Chiara, yourself, you quoted some figures of some of them in the beginning of this conference. For obvious reason, it is difficult to come up with extremely robust figure, because by definition, we're talking of something which is partly hidden. And as such, it calls for some proxies and some estimate to come up with figures. That's why you see usually sharply different figures depending on who does the estimate. The Commission itself is not doing this kind of estimate, but the new and interesting development this year is that we have partnered with the Parliament, which has provided some funding, to create an EU tax observatory, which will start operating as of June, notably. This EU tax observatory will be independent, completely independent, so it will not take guidance from the Commission or from anyone. We are just here to help together with the Parliament to create it and make sure it has the means it needs to operate. And it has been entrusted to a very solid team of economists, in which you find big names, which are usually well known from the NGOs, such as Gabriel Zuckman, who is the director of the EU Tax Observatory. And in his team, you have people which are quite well known from economists, like Thomas Piketty or Emmanuel Saez. So I'm sure we will have here a very competent team, which will be able to improve our understanding of the flows on issues related to tax avoidance and tax evasion, including in the member state, because that should certainly be an added value of the tax observatory, having a capacity to analyze and say things which, for obvious reason, not everyone has.
Thanks. So I see also another question to Benjamin Angel, but also feel free, Paul Tango and Jane, to jump in if you want to comment on the other's answer or on the questions. So Giovanna asked, does the Code of Conduct group check the effectiveness of the new substance requirement once these are introduced by a third country? And also, do third countries have any right to go before the European Court of Justice in case they complain for mistreatment by the EU?
The first question, no. Unfortunately, there is no effectiveness check whatsoever today. It doesn't mean that the concept of effectiveness is completely foreign, because with the activity of the Code of Conduct is sometimes linked to rating from other bodies, such as the Global Forum or the Forum for Harmful Tax Practices, which themselves include some effectiveness component. But today there is no autonomous rating of the Code of Conduct on effectiveness consideration, and this is certainly something which going forward we intend to develop. It is also very often one of the differences between the national list and the EU list, because member states, by definition, they know when they make a request or when they assess something, whether they get the information. The Commission is not a tax authority. We do not raise taxes. We do not exchange tax information. So as such, for us, it is difficult to assess it. And we will need going forward to build a system which make better use of the views that member states can have on the effectiveness of the commitment taken. That will take time, certainly, but we have started already to discuss it, and this direction is not controversial within the Code of Conduct. Now, on the second question, well, the answer is no. Very clearly, there is no European Court of Justice possibility of appeal from third countries. We are not talking here of something which is creating as such a legal obligation on the third country. It is a unilateral process by definition, and the conclusions are not binding on the third country, they are binding on our member state. So if a country is put on the blacklist, the so-called blacklist, then it has consequences by EU law and by national law. It does not mean, though, because I wouldn't like the people that listen to us to jump to the wrong conclusion, that there is no discussion process with the country concerned. There is a very intense discussion process with the country concerns, and I can tell you that I have in my team 12 people working full-time on discussing with the countries which are in scope. It's a constant ping pong when they provide us their explanation, we provide comment on their draft, we come back, etc., etc. So we never ever come to a discussion without having had many rounds of discussion with the country concerns to understand, to make sure first that we get it right, to allow the country concerned to provide explanation, to adjust, etc., etc. Actually, in preparation for this conference, I have asked my team to check the number of countries with whom we had such meeting last year. We had meeting with 54 countries. And not one, repeatedly with 54 countries. So it is it's a machinery behind it, which admittedly is not visible from the outside, but which allows to have informed decision.
Yeah, we believe that there is an artwork behind. There is a question for Jane from always the journalist Sarah Pais from Tax Notes. So what is the best way to give developing countries the tools to implement non-harmful tax practices, both domestically and internationally? And how can the EU make its blacklisting process both more collaborative, but also more understanding to the very different political and economic situation of developing countries?
Okay, thank you so much. Sarah, for that question. The best way for EU to give developing countries that tool, but also to make the blacklisting process more collaborative, is to make it more inclusive. It is important that developing countries are part of the standard making process. This will ensure that there is ownership of those standards, and they will be able to ensure that the standards take into account the developing countries' economic situation. Because what's happening today, I think that's the biggest challenge, is that lack of inclusivity. Some of the standards which are put on table can't be implemented by developing countries. And maybe that's one of the reasons that when you look at the blacklist, many developing countries are on that list. So it's important, one, for developing countries to participate, to be on that table, to be part of the standard making process. But again, I'm not underestimating the issue of capacity building for developing countries to be able to implement the standards. In Africa, for example, there is already an institution, ATAF, the Africa Tax Administrators Forum. It's doing a great work to build capacity of governments in Africa to be able to implement some of the standards. But again, the issue of capacity building for our governments to strengthen legal frameworks, to strengthen institutions is very critical and needs to be done. But the whole issue of setting that, to be on that table, to set the standard is very, very critical. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. So maybe the last questions, let's see if we have more time to poll thanks, since we have a lot of representatives from member states in this event. What would be your message to other member states in terms of what role their government need to play in order to increase the pressure on real tax haven in this world?
Yeah, thank you. And well, of course, many of the discussions on taxations are European and international and should be like that. So we have the OECD's negotiations that are ongoing and should result by the end of June into a conclusion. We have the initiatives from the commissions, which we eagerly await on shell companies, and of course Article 116, which will definitely, I expect a proposal from the Commission, Benjamin. And at the same time, we also have to focus very much on the member states themselves. And when you talk about scrutiny of, let's say, the blacklist, it's very clear that the EU countries are not involved. Then again, from the European Parliament, we do as much as possible to put those member states in the spotlight, so to say. And that the first start is the RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where countries that introduced their plans should also take into account what they do against money laundering and tax avoidance, and especially if there is a country-specific recommendation on that. And that applies, as I know perfectly well, also to the Netherlands. So that's the first opportunity. So that gives the leverage also, because this is where the leverage comes from, the access to the recovery fund. So that's the first. The second, what we want to do in the European Parliament is also to have a discussion on the tax scoreboard as part of. So the process we have now for the RF should be more become more systemic and make sure that every time there's a very clear scoreboard, and that the countries, the European member states, are held against this tax scoreboard. So that's the way forward. Like I said, it's not just about European and international message is also very much on pressure on the member states to change. And in the years to come, optimistically I say that this pressure will can have a success.
Thanks, certainly. I see a question on Uganda of course, for Jane. Your country has been trying to renegotiate the trade agreement with Netherlands for over 2 years. Do you know why does the process seem so slow?
Okay, thank you so much. Uganda has been negotiating the double taxation agreement with the Netherlands for the last 2 years. The delay has been on both sides. Uganda first worked on a policy, a double taxation agreement policy, which didn't have in place, and that also took some time. But also on the side of the Netherlands government, it has also taken some time to respond to the issues. But the discussions are on, and we hope they will be concluded soon.
Thanks. Maybe just last question to Mr. Angel and Tang with very short answer. Do you see a committing will from EU member states to renounce to their national list and fully adopt only the EU list, or are there some member states still reluctant? As you want. Okay.
We have 12 national lists today, some for a long time, some less so. So far, only 2 member states which had a list at the time where the EU list was introduced have abandoned it. The other maintain it. We have started a process of discussion with member states. The first stage for us is to understand better the differences between the two. Because today, to be honest, the situation is a bit messy, and that's really an understatement, since for half of the jurisdictions screened also at EU level, you get a different conclusion in any of the national lists. And we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the finance minister of the third country concerned. It's certainly very hard to read. So first, we need to understand why we have those differences, and then we need to try to learn also from the experience of the national list, because as I said during this conference, usually they have a better knowledge of the effectiveness of the commitment taken, whether the country concerned deliver. And once we have done this exercise of bringing more intellectual consistency between the national list and the EU list, then there will certainly be room for discussing on a better alignment of the two, at least for the countries which have been screened, because it's extremely difficult to a third country which sometimes has to do extremely complex and difficult efforts to change its legislation, and not always easy to convince its national parliament that it does it. It's still listed, but it's still listed in a couple of member states.
Yeah, this is the reason why the European Parliament wants to focus on the withholding tax, on a European framework. We now see different lists. Personally, I'm not convinced that the national lists are always effective, since they usually discuss nominal tax rates and not effective tax rates, and because it allows for rerouting of the flows to avoid the countries on the list. So I very much would like to see a more common approach, and hopefully a more effective approach. One example, for example, the Netherlands has introduced a blacklist, and Uber has changed the location, make a rerouting not from Bermuda, but now to Singapore. With Singapore is not on the list because the formal tariff is higher than I believe 9%. So in that sense. So I like the discussion, but it should eventually lead to a common and effective approach.
Yeah, I agree. So we arrive at our closing time. I just want to mention 5 key words that came out from the discussion. Theater of absurd, that was the description of the tax haven by Obermeyer. The social contract that was mentioned by the Danish Minister of Taxation, that is undermined, the social contract is undermined by the tax havens. Jane mentioned a lot of time inclusive and ownership. So the importance to make developing country more, to make them more participate more in the listing process and in a fair way. Mr. Tang mentioned the need of political will. So there are instruments, but we need the political will, especially of the political representatives. And Mr. Angel mentioned as the EU listing process is a learning process. So you acknowledge that there are positive and negative sides and that we need to reform. And since today in this event, we had representatives from different member states also in the audience, I hope that what emerged from the discussion this morning can feed the current reforming process in the Council. We as civil society, but also the journalists and the other national institutions are, I think we are all available to contribute to this common fight. And let me conclude with a concept expressed by Commissioner Vestager on Tuesday during the hearing of the FIS committee. So if we turn the word tax havens in tax heavens, so like a paradise or Eden has the French translation paradis fiscal or paradiso fiscale in Italian, this country should actually be a place where everyone pays their fair share of taxes and not a place where you don't not pay taxes. So let's all work and cooperate to achieve this goal. So thank you very much from my side, from Oxfam, for participating in our conference, and a special thanks to our speakers from the enlightening contribution. I wish you a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.